All right, let's dive into American history. Before any Europeans showed up, this land was not empty, not even close. It was home to millions of Native Americans living in incredibly diverse societies. Think about the Mississippian cultures building huge earthen mounds, or the Iroquois Confederacy with its sophisticated political system. These weren't just scattered tribes. They were complex civilizations with rich cultures, intricate trade networks, and deep connections to the land. They farmed, they hunted, they governed themselves, and they had been doing so for thousands of years. Remember, history didn't start when the white guys arrived, okay? That's super important. Then came the Europeans, around the late 1400s. Why? Well, the old standbys, gold, God, and glory. Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain in 1492, wasn't the first European to reach the Americas. Vikings were here centuries earlier, but his voyages kicked off sustained contact. This led to the Columbian Exchange. This was a massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, technology, and ideas between the Old World, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World, the Americas. Think potatoes and corn going to Europe, and horses and smallpox coming to the Americas. For Native Americans, the disease part was catastrophic, wiping out huge percentages of their populations. It was a biological catastrophe of epic proportions. So, Europeans started setting up shop. The Spanish were big in Florida and the Southwest. The French were mostly in Canada and the Mississippi Valley, focused on fur trading. But for our story, the English are key. Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607, was the first permanent English settlement. It was a rough start, like really rough. Starvation, disease, conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. They were looking for gold but found tobacco, which became a cash crop and saved the colony, economically speaking. Then, in 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in what became Massachusetts. They were seeking religious freedom, or at least freedom to practice their very specific brand of Puritanism. These early settlements laid the groundwork for different colonial regions. New England, with places like Massachusetts, was shaped by Puritan religious values. They focused on small farms, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The middle colonies, think New York, Pennsylvania, were more diverse. You had English, Dutch, German, Scots-Irish folks. They had fertile land, so they became the breadbasket colonies, growing lots of grain. And then the southern colonies, like Virginia and South Carolina. These were all about large plantations, growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo, initially using indentured servants, but increasingly relying on the brutal system of enslaved African labor. These regional differences are going to be a big deal later. Life in the colonies wasn't easy, but it offered opportunities many didn't have in Europe. Land was more available, even if it was often taken from Native Americans. There was a degree of self-government, with colonial assemblies making local laws. But Britain was still the boss, and after the French and Indian War, which was part of a bigger global conflict called the 7 Years' War, ending in 1763, Britain was deeply in debt. So they looked to the colonies to help pay for it. This meant new taxes and tighter control, things like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, taxes on everyday items. Colonists got really upset. Their big slogan? No taxation without representation. They felt they shouldn't be taxed if they didn't have elected representatives in the British Parliament. This unhappiness grew. Events like the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers fired on a crowd, and the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists dumped tea into the harbour to protest a tea tax, fanned the flames of resistance. Britain responded with even stricter laws, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. Things escalated quickly. In April 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. It was on. The colonists, led by figures like George Washington, were fighting for their independence against the most powerful empire in the world. It was a huge gamble, a truly revolutionary act. Then came the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, mostly written by Thomas Jefferson. This document laid out the colonists' reasons for separating from Britain. It famously stated that all men are created equal and have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, all men didn't actually mean all men back then. It mostly meant white, property-owning men. But the ideas were powerful and would shape American ideals for centuries. The war itself was long and difficult. The Continental Army faced many defeats, but also key victories like Saratoga, which convinced France to help the Americans. French money and military support were crucial. Imagine trying to win your independence without a navy, and then France shows up with ships. Finally, in 1781, the American and French forces won a decisive victory at Yorktown, Virginia. This pretty much ended the major fighting. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing American independence. The United States of America was born. But now what? The first government, under the Articles of Confederation, was deliberately weak. The states were afraid of a strong central government, like the British one they just fought. But this weak government couldn't effectively tax, regulate trade, or enforce laws. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, a farmers' revolt, highlighted these weaknesses. It became clear that a new, stronger government was needed. So, the Articles of Confederation weren't cutting it. In 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Their job was to fix the Articles, but they ended up creating a whole new government. This is where we get the US Constitution. There were big debates. How should states be represented? The Great Compromise created a two-house legislature, the Senate, with equal representation for each state, and the House of Representatives, with representation based on population. And what about slavery? The 3/5 Compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation purposes. A dark compromise that baked slavery into the nation's founding document. The Constitution also created 3 branches of government: legislative, which is Congress; executive, that's the President; and judicial, the Supreme Court, with a system of checks and balances. With the Constitution ratified, after a promise to add a Bill of Rights protecting individual freedoms, George Washington became the first president in 1789. The early years were about setting up the new government. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, had a plan to strengthen the nation's finances, including creating a national bank. This was controversial. Meanwhile, the country was growing. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 from France doubled the size of the US overnight. Lewis and Clark then led an expedition to explore this vast new territory. This fueled the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This westward expansion brought a lot of conflict. Conflict with Native American tribes who were pushed off their lands. Conflict with Mexico, leading to the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, which added even more territory, including California. But the biggest conflict brewing was over slavery. As new states wanted to join the Union, the question was always, would they be free states or slave states? The South's economy, especially after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, became heavily dependent on King Cotton and the labor of enslaved African Americans. This system was brutal and dehumanizing, and it created a deep moral and economic divide with the North. The North was industrializing. Factories were springing up and cities were growing. Its economy was based on wage labor, not slave labor. These different economic systems and social values led to growing sectionalism, loyalty to one's own region rather than to the nation as a whole. Congress tried to keep the peace with compromises, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri enters as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and a line drawn for future slave states. But these were just temporary fixes. Each new territory, each new debate over tariffs or states' rights just seemed to deepen the chasm between North and South. The foundation for a massive conflict was being laid, piece by painful piece. The 1850s were a disaster decade. Tensions over slavery reached a boiling point. The Compromise of 1850 tried to smooth things over, California as a free state, a tougher Fugitive Slave Act, but it just made many Northerners angrier. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, allowing settlers in those territories to decide on slavery themselves, what they called popular sovereignty. This led to Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces rushed in and started killing each other. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress couldn't ban slavery in the territories. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, an attempt to start a slave uprising, terrified the South. The nation was a powder keg. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the expansion of slavery, in 1860 was the spark. Southern states saw this as a threat to their way of life and their peculiar institution. Starting with South Carolina, 11 states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln said secession was illegal. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. It was a brutal, bloody conflict, pitting American against American, brother against brother. The deadliest war in American history by far. The Union, the North, had more people, more factories, and more railroads. The Confederacy, the South, had strong military leadership, at least early on, like Robert E. Lee, and was fighting a defensive war on its own territory. Key battles included Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, which led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This declared slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free. It changed the war's purpose, not just to save the Union, but also to end slavery. Gettysburg and Vicksburg in 1863 were major turning points, shifting the tide in favor of the Union. General Ulysses S. Grant eventually took command of the Union armies and ground down the Confederacy. The war ended in April 1865, when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was preserved, and slavery was abolished nationwide by the 13th Amendment. But the cost was immense. Hundreds of thousands dead, the South devastated. And just days after the surrender, President Lincoln was assassinated. Now came the incredibly difficult period of Reconstruction, roughly 1865 to 1877. How to rebuild the South, how to bring the former Confederate states back into the Union, and crucially, what would be the status of the nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection of the laws, and the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. But progress was met with fierce resistance, violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and a waning commitment from the North. Reconstruction ultimately ended in 1877, leaving many promises of equality unfulfilled, a legacy we still grapple with.